February 1988, the day the story breaks open. In a Brooklyn hospital, Chris Rock at 23 stands beside his father Julius Rock, who does not wake from what was called a simple ulcer surgery. The man who raised 8 children on about $12,000 a year, who worked 2 jobs and close to 90 hours a week, is gone. That morning, laughter loses its echo. From that loss, everything else becomes a test. The boy from Bedford-Stuyvesant, who once tied his shoes so tight they hurt, will turn pain into craft. 4 Emmys, 3 Grammys, arena tours across America. Then another earthquake years later at the Oscars in front of tens of millions. But the first and deepest rupture is here in 1980. A white room, still hands, a son with no words left. This video is the full journey from that room to the biggest stages on earth. From silence to truth, from humiliation to control. Numbers you will not believe, moments you will not forget, names you know, choices you will judge, lessons you can use. If this is the story you want told straight, subscribe now so you do not miss the next chapter. And tell me in the comments, what year were you born? It was February 1988, the kind of cold morning that could cut through glass. Inside a small Brooklyn hospital, under the pale flicker of white light, Chris Rock stood still. He was 23 years old, broke, exhausted, and about to lose the man who built his entire world. Julius Rock, the truck driver who had spent nearly 40 years hauling freight and newspapers through the sleepless streets of New York City, now lay silent. His hands, once rough with oil and work, were finally still. It was supposed to be a simple operation for an ulcer. The doctors said it would be fine, but simple things can kill too. In a city of 8 million beating hearts, one suddenly stopped. And in that instant, a son understood that every laugh he ever chased had been born from this man's quiet strength. Julius had raised 8 children on little more than $12,000 a year. He woke before the sun, sometimes slept in his truck, and counted every coin before paying the bills. He was no celebrity, no hero in headlines. Yet in that small apartment on Decatur Street, he was a giant, carrying his family through storms with nothing but grit, sweat, and love that never asked for applause. When Chris looked at him that day, he did not see death. He saw a lifetime of struggle turned into dignity. The room was so quiet that even the machines seemed afraid to make a sound. And in that silence, something inside him broke. That February morning in 1988, laughter lost its echo, and a son learned that even the strongest hands must one day let go. Let us go back to where it all began, before the fame, before the spotlight, before the laughter could pay the bills. It was 1911 Brooklyn, New York. The air smelled of gasoline and rain. The streets were alive with shouting, subway clatter, and the quiet struggle of families trying to stay afloat. And inside a small 2-bedroom apartment on Decatur Street, a 10-year-old boy named Chris Rock was learning how to survive in a world that never learned how to see him. His father, Julius, worked as a truck driver and paper delivery man, leaving home before the sun rose and coming back long after it fell. He worked close to 90 hours every week, sometimes falling asleep still wearing his work boots. His mother, Rosalie, taught preschool during the day and served as a social worker at night. Together, they were the heartbeat of a home that ran on faith more than food. 8 children shared 2 beds, 1 bathroom, and one dream that things might get better someday. Rent was $50 a month. Some nights, dinner was nothing more than bread and rice. And when the silence felt heavy, Julius would tell a joke to make the children laugh. That was Chris's first real lesson in comedy. He discovered that laughter could feed the spirit when there was nothing left to feed the body. At 10 years old, the city assigned him to a new school across town. It was part of an integration program meant to bring equality, but for him, it brought pain. Every morning, he boarded a yellow bus out of Bedford-Stuyvesant into a neighborhood where no one wanted him. He was one of only a few black children surrounded by hundreds of white faces that met him with cold eyes and cruel hands. They tripped him, shoved him, and called him names that stayed long after the bruises healed. Sometimes they poured milk on his lunch. Sometimes they spat in it. He tied his shoes so tight his fingers hurt, hoping the knots would keep him from falling apart. He never told his parents. He carried those wounds home like homework, unfinished and unseen. The teachers did not stop it. The world did not notice. Well, Brooklyn in the 1970s was a storm of poverty and prejudice, and Chris stood in the middle of it, small but unbroken. In that storm, he learned to listen. He began to study the rhythm of voices, the pauses between words, the difference between laughter and cruelty. By 13, he had stopped trying to fit in. He walked fast, spoke softly, and used humor like armor. Every insult became a story, every scar a lesson. He did not know it then, but the boy who learned to be invisible was already becoming something the world could never ignore. By the time Chris Rock turned 18, New York City had already tested him in every way a city could test a man. The year was 1986. The skyline glowed like a promise, but down on the streets, it was all struggle and noise. Chris was thin, restless, and broke, carrying nothing but a notebook full of half-jokes and a hunger that could fill the whole city. He worked anywhere that would have him, at a fast food stand, flipping burgers for $3.35 an hour, mopping diner floors after midnight until his hands smelled like bleach and grease, carrying packages for men who forgot his name the moment he left the room. Every dollar mattered. Every coin meant another day he could stay alive in Brooklyn. Home was a single rented room the size of a closet. The ceiling leaked, the window rattled, and the radiator hissed like it was tired of living. On cold nights, he slept in his jacket, counting the cracks above him like stars. Dinner was often one slice of pizza. Sometimes nothing at all. But when he closed his eyes, he saw light. He saw himself on a stage, and that was enough to keep going. Every evening, after long shifts and short meals, he took the train to tiny comedy clubs scattered across Manhattan. The rooms were smoky, the air thick with beer and impatience. The crowds were rough, half drunk, waiting for someone to fail. He stepped on stage holding a cracked microphone that squealed before it spoke, and tried to make strangers laugh before they finished their drinks. Most nights, they did not. Some booed, some threw peanuts. One night they all walked out, leaving him talking to empty chairs. But even then, he smiled. Once he said, "I guess I just got paid in peanuts," and someone in the back laughed. That single sound was enough to bring him back the next night. He wrote jokes on napkins, on diner receipts, on old scraps of paper he found on the floor. He studied Richard Pryor and George Carlin until he could hear their rhythm in his sleep. He began to understand that comedy was not about being funny. It was about telling the truth. And sometimes the truth hurts so much. The only way to say it is to make people laugh. Then came one night in the winter of 1986 that changed everything. The club was Catch a Rising Star, one of the few places where unknown comics dared to dream. The lights were dim, the air filled with smoke, and somewhere in the back stood Eddie Murphy. He was 25 and already a legend, the king of American comedy. Chris went on stage, nervous but burning inside. He stumbled through his set, the jokes rough but real. Eddie watched him closely. After the show, he walked up to the young comic and said softly that he had something special. Then he handed him his phone number. For Chris, that moment was like lightning striking in the dark. A few weeks later, Eddie called. He invited Chris to appear in Beverly Hills Cop 2. The part was tiny, only a few seconds on screen, and the paycheck was $600. But to Chris, it felt like the world had finally noticed he existed. It was the first time laughter had paid him back. He called home that night. His father, Julius, answered. His voice was proud but calm. He told Chris to stay grounded and to remember where he came from. Chris promised he would. He meant it. 2 years later, in early 1980, Julius fell ill. The doctors said it was only an ulcer. They said not to worry. Chris believed them. He was performing almost every night, saving money, planning to take his parents to one of his shows. Then one morning the phone rang. His mother's voice was quiet, too quiet. She said he needed to come to the hospital. He ran across the city, but when he arrived, it was too late. Julius Rock was gone. The man who had worked 2 jobs for 40 years, who had raised 8 children on little more than $12,000 a year, was gone. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and loss. Machines hummed gently as if refusing to accept the truth. Chris stood beside the bed, staring at his father's hands. Those hands had built everything he had ever known. They had fixed cars, held babies, counted coins, and wiped tears. Now they were still. For a long time, he said nothing. There were no jokes left to tell, no sound left to make. The boy who had turned pain into laughter finally met a silence he could not break. That winter of 1988, something changed in him. The fire that once burned for fame began to burn for purpose. He made a quiet promise in that hospital room that every laugh from that day forward would carry his father's name. From then on, every time Chris Rock stepped into the light, he was not just chasing laughter. He was honoring the man who taught him to stand tall. The fire had begun long before the silence, and now it would never go out. Success came to Chris Rock like a storm that refused to stop raining. By 1990, he had gone from performing in smoky basement clubs for tips to standing under the bright blue lights of Saturday Night Live. For a kid who once counted change for bus fare, it felt unreal. Studio 8H was cold, alive, and merciless. Every laugh had to be earned. Every silence felt like a death sentence. The first night he went live, his heart was beating louder than the crowd. Millions were watching, but all he could think about was his father, the man who never got to see this moment. He told himself he would make it worth it. He did. For 3 seasons, he fought to be heard in a room filled with giants. He was young, black, and fearless in a place that did not always welcome that kind of energy. He wrote until his hands cramped, rewrote until the sun came up. Behind the camera, the writer's room looked like a war zone, full of coffee cups, cigarette smoke, and panic. Everyone fought for airtime, for a single joke that could survive the cut. Some nights, Chris won. Most nights, he lost. But he never stopped showing up. He once said, "You do not make it in this business, you survive it." And that was the truth. The pressure was brutal. The competition endless. Fame came dressed as opportunity, but it carried a hidden cost. By 1990, he left Saturday Night Live broke, exhausted, and uncertain if he would ever work again. He walked through New York at night, staring at his reflection in empty storefronts. He was too famous to start over, too broke to stop. But pain has a strange way of teaching discipline. He went back to where it all started, the small clubs, the flickering lights, the same cracked microphones that once betrayed him. He performed for tiny crowds, 6 people, sometimes fewer. He told the truth, and slowly the fire came back. In '96, everything changed again. The HBO special, Bring the Pain, turned a survivor into a legend. The jokes were sharp, raw, and dangerous. They cut through America like a mirror nobody wanted to face. It won him 2 Emmy Awards, sold out arenas, and made him the new voice of American truth. Overnight, he became the comedian every politician feared and every comic wanted to be. But fame is a double-edged sword. The more people cheered, the more alone he felt. Every standing ovation came with another sleepless night. By '99, he was performing over 200 shows a year. His face was on every screen, his voice in every headline, his schedule filled with airports, hotel rooms, and microphones. The title sounded fearless. Bring the Pain, bigger and blacker, never scared. But behind those names was a man burning himself to keep the world warm. He once said that when people call you the best, you stop sleeping because you are afraid they will find out you are not. Some nights, after a show that earned thunderous applause, he would sit alone in a dressing room lit by a single fluorescent bulb. His hands trembled from exhaustion, his face still wet from sweat and spotlight. He looked into the mirror and saw not a star, but a man disappearing behind the noise. He remembered the hospital room, his father's hands, the silence that started it all. He had everything he once dreamed of, but the man he wanted to show it to was gone. Between 1990 and 2000, he tried to balance success with truth. The Chris Rock Show gave him a weapon sharper than any punchline. He grilled politicians, challenged power, and made audiences laugh while questioning everything they believed. It was bold, fearless, and earned him 3 more Emmys. But it also took more from him than anyone could see. Behind the cameras, the smile faded. His body ached from constant travel. His mind never rested. Even laughter, his lifelong refuge, started to sound hollow. Fame, he realized, was not a finish line. It was a treadmill that never stopped moving. The faster he ran, the further away peace became. At 35, he stood at the height of his career. 4 Emmy Awards, 3 Grammys, sold-out tours across America, net worth climbing past $20 million. But money could not fix the emptiness that waited in every hotel room. He had survived poverty, racism, and loss. But now he faced a quieter enemy: success. It was bright, beautiful, and dangerous. It could blind you if you looked too long. So he kept moving, kept talking, kept laughing, because silence still scared him. The same silence that had followed him from childhood to the hospital room, from pain to power. He had turned it into his rhythm, his armor, his art. But inside, he knew the truth. The louder the applause grew, the quieter his soul became. And that was the price of light. It was 1996, and Chris Rock was standing in the middle of everything he had once dreamed about. Fame, awards, fortune, and respect had all arrived at once like a wave he was not ready to ride. His shows sold out in minutes. His face was on television screens across America. He had gone from small comedy clubs to global tours, and his fortune had passed $10 million before he turned 35. But success, like fire, gives warmth while it burns everything too close to it. That same year, he met Malak Compton, a woman who lived far from the noise of fame. She worked in public relations, calm, elegant, and grounded. Where Chris brought chaos, she brought quiet. He later said that being near her felt like standing still for the first time in his life. She was not drawn to the spotlight. She was drawn to the man still hiding behind it. They married in '96 in a simple ceremony, surrounded by family. No photographers, no flashing lights, just vows whispered between 2 people who believed love could outlast fame. Their home was in Alpine, New Jersey, a quiet town filled with tall trees and slow mornings. For the first time, Chris had peace. When their first daughter, Lola Simone, was born in 2002, his world shifted. He said that was the day he stopped chasing applause and started chasing sleep. 2 years later, their second daughter, Zara Savannah, arrived. The laughter that once came from audiences now came from tiny voices in the hallway. Mornings smelled of baby lotion and coffee. Evenings were filled with lullabies instead of punchlines. At home, he was not Chris Rock the comedian. He was Dad. He pushed strollers through Central Park, his cap pulled low, smiling at people who had no idea the man beside them could sell out Madison Square Garden. For a while, he believed he had escaped the curse of fame. But fame has its own gravity. By 2005, his calendar was full again. 200 shows a year, film sets, interviews, endless flights. His net worth crossed $25 million. Yet every success took him farther from home. Missed birthdays became normal. Phone calls grew shorter. The same silence that once saved him began to return. Heavier this time, Malak stayed steady. She built Styleworks, a nonprofit that helped women rebuild confidence after hardship. While she lifted others, she was quietly losing the man she loved. Their home remained beautiful, but the laughter inside had changed. Chris later said that a marriage does not break from shouting. It breaks from silence. And that silence had been building for years. He began to live in 2 worlds, one filled with applause and spotlights, the other filled with distance and regret. Fame can fool a man into believing he is untouchable. It whispers that rules do not apply to him. Chris believed that lie. He admitted later that he had been unfaithful, that success had made him selfish. He said he was not a good husband and that it was nobody's fault but his own. But the affair was only the symptom. The truth ran deeper. He had spent his whole life performing, even at home. When pain came, he joked. When fear came, he ran. When love came, he did not know how to hold it. By 2014, their marriage had reached its quiet end. After 19 years together, they announced their separation. The divorce was finalized in 2016. The financial details were never public, but the emotional cost was written across his face. The man who once turned pain into laughter was now facing pain he could not escape. He entered therapy for the first time, not to fix his career, but to fix himself. He began to talk about the things he had hidden for decades: his fear of love, his addiction to attention, his habit of using humor to avoid truth. Therapy became a mirror that showed him the man behind the jokes. He realized that attention was not affection and that applause was not the same as peace. Slowly, he began to rebuild. He stayed close to his daughters, picking them up from school, sitting in the crowd during recitals, and cooking breakfast when he was home. He once said that being a father was the only standing ovation that still mattered. Malak never spoke with anger. She focused on her children and continued helping women find strength after loss. She said that sometimes love does not end in anger. It ends in acceptance. Chris learned that lesson too. He understood that redemption is not a single act. It is repetition. It is showing up again and again until you earn back the right to be trusted. By the time he turned 50, he had learned the hardest truth of all. Success can fill your wallet, but empty your heart if you are not careful. The man who had spent his life making the world laugh finally learned to listen. He no longer chased crowds or trophies. He chased peace. Quiet mornings, honest talks, time with his daughters. He learned that growth does not come from applause. It comes from facing what hurts and choosing to stay anyway. The boy who once survived by telling jokes had finally learned to live without them. And in that silence, the same silence that once broke him, Chris Rock finally found redemption. It was March 27, 2022, the night of the Academy Awards. The Dolby Theater in Los Angeles glowed like a golden cathedral. The air was thick with perfume, diamonds, and expectation. Cameras flashed, violins played, and the most famous faces in the world smiled under 100 lights. Chris Rock walked on stage dressed in a dark suit, confident, calm, and ready to do what he had done for almost 40 years: make the world laugh. He had been here before, hosting, joking, commanding the room. The crowd loved him. Then came one line, one harmless joke about Jada Pinkett Smith, the wife of actor Will Smith. It lasted only a few seconds. The audience laughed, but something shifted. From the front row, Will Smith rose from his seat. His face was cold, his eyes locked. He walked toward the stage, slow and deliberate, every step cutting through the noise. Chris smiled, thinking it was a bit. It was not. The moment happened faster than breath. Will raised his hand and struck him across the face. The sound cracked through the room like a thunderclap. For one long second, time froze. 800 people in tuxedos and gowns sat frozen in disbelief. The world watching on television went silent. Chris did not move. His cheek burned, his ears rang, and yet his body stayed perfectly still. He did not curse. He did not shout. He did not strike back. He blinked once, then said softly, "Wow." The audience laughed nervously, unsure if it was part of the act. But it was not acting. It was discipline. It was grace. That single moment, only 7 seconds long, became one of the most replayed clips in television history. Within 24 hours, more than 50 million people had watched it online. In one night, A lifetime of laughter was overshadowed by silence and shock. Backstage, Chris stood alone. No anger, no tears, just stillness. A man who had survived racism, poverty, and heartbreak now stood under the harshest light of all humiliation. Yet even then, he did not break. He had learned long ago that silence can be louder than violence. While the world erupted in debate, Chris said nothing. No interviews, no press, no blame. For a year, he kept quiet while others shouted. People called him weak, others called him noble. But the truth was simpler. He was waiting, waiting for the noise to fade, for the smoke to clear, for the pain to become something he could use. And when he finally spoke, he did it the only way he knew how on stage. In March 2023, Netflix premiered Selective Outrage, the first live global stand-up special ever streamed to more than 170 countries. It was Chris Rock's return, and the world watched. The stage was dark. A single spotlight cut through the black. The microphone waited like an old friend. He began slow, calm and razor sharp. He spoke about fame, about failure, about the night that changed everything. He told the truth, but without venom. He said that pain had taught him control, that anger without wisdom is just noise. The audience laughed, cried, and cheered. In that moment, it said, he turned humiliation into art, and art into forgiveness. When the show ended, the applause was thunder. But this time, it was not for the jokes. It was for the man, for his strength, for his grace under fire. He said later, "You do not fight fire with fire. You wait until the smoke clears, then you rebuild." And he did. Will Smith apologized publicly, privately, and again in writing. He called the moment a scar for life. Chris never answered publicly, but those close to him said he had already forgiven him long before the world stopped talking about it. Because forgiveness, for him, was not weakness, it was freedom. By 2024, his life had settled into a quieter rhythm. His two daughters, Lola and Zara, had grown into young women chasing their own dreams. Lola studied in Paris, exploring art and culture with the same curiosity her father had for truth. Zara attended the University of Southern California, working with her mother's foundation, Styleworks, helping women rebuild their lives with dignity. Chris split his time between New York and New Jersey, living in a 10,000 square foot home worth nearly $6 million, the same house he bought back in 2001. Inside, the walls were lined with photos of his daughters, his late parents, the friends he had lost along the way. It was not a mansion of luxury. It was a museum of memory. He still performed, but now it was different. He appeared unannounced in small comedy clubs around New York. No cameras, no publicity, just a man with a microphone, testing new truths. The laughs were softer, the pauses longer. The fire had not gone out. It had simply become light. He once said, "I am not interested in being the funniest man in the world anymore. I just want to be the most honest." Honesty became his legacy. By 2020, his fortune had grown to over $60 million. But his wealth was measured differently now, in peace, in presence, in forgiveness. He began each morning with meditation, walks through the park, and gratitude for a life that had once felt impossible. He was diagnosed in 2020 with nonverbal learning disorder, a condition that made social cues and communication difficult. Instead of hiding it, he spoke about it openly. He said it made him understand himself better, that it explained why silence had always been both his strength and his curse. He kept going to therapy, not to fix anything, but to keep listening. He said, "You do not heal once, you keep healing every day." The man who once turned his childhood pain into laughter, who turned humiliation into art, now turned silence into wisdom. By 60, Chris Rock had lived through every version of the American dream: the boy from Brooklyn who flipped burgers, the comedian who conquered the world, the husband who fell, and the father who rose again. The world still remembered the slap, but those who looked closer saw something deeper. The way he stood still, the way he smiled through pain, the way he refused to hate. He had walked through poverty, through loss, through fire, and through fame. But when the lights faded, what remained was not anger or ego, but peace. In the end, Chris Rock proved something that awards and headlines never could. That real strength is not in striking back. It is in standing still. He once said, "Greatness is not about never breaking. It is about rebuilding with love." And as the applause of the world began to fade once more, Chris stood under one last quiet spotlight, smiling softly. The same light that once burned him now warmed him. The silence that once hurt him now held him. Because after all the noise, all the laughter, all the fire, what was left was grace. Every story leaves behind a truth, and Chris Rock's story is not just about fame or pain. It is about endurance, the kind that does not shout, but quietly refuses to give up. He taught us that strength is not in fighting back, but in choosing when not to. That silence can speak louder than anger, and that sometimes the most powerful answer is grace. Through poverty, racism, heartbreak, and humiliation. He never stopped standing. He never stopped learning. He showed that failure does not define you, how you rise after it does. The boy who once hid behind laughter became a man who stood in truth. And maybe that is what growing up really means. Not becoming perfect, but becoming honest. We live in a world obsessed with being seen, with being loud, with proving who we are. But Chris Rock's journey reminds us that real power comes from knowing yourself even when no one is watching. It is the courage to stay calm when the world loses its mind. It is choosing peace over revenge, discipline over rage, humility over pride. If you have ever been misunderstood, laughed at, or underestimated, remember this: the world can take everything from you except your response, and your response can change everything. Thank you for watching this story and walking with us through the fire and the silence. If this story inspired you, remember to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next one. And now I want to know, who are you in this story? Tell me in the comments, what year were you born? Because no matter what your age is, it is never too late to start again, to stand taller, and to find your own sound of grace, of grace, of grace, of grace.